Hello and welcome. Here is what we have implemented in the previous video where we had a dependency for the OpenAI and then we made use of the OpenAI chat client, and this chat client was used to make a call to the chat completion API with the message. But there was a problem. The problem was that our chat client was not able to retain any context. So let's have a quick revision of the problem. So let's say here is my API and I make a request to it, maybe call it as what is Google, tell me in one line, and make the request. Here is the answer, and if I ask what is the context of this discussion, now it does not know about the context clearly, so we need to fix it somehow. And I found that this is a known thing, and here is what explanation behind this behavior is. So people have asked like, how can I maintain conversation continuity with ChatGPT API? And the answer is like, LLM models are stateless, meaning that every single bit of context you wanted to consider should be passed with every interaction with it through the message. So the idea is that by default the LLM won't have any memory of it which will be used to maintain the context of the discussion. Rather, you will have to supply it explicitly, and this is what is being done by the tools such as ChatGPT and Gemini as well. So to explore it, let's open the network tab, and to demonstrate it, let's open either of the previous chat discussion. So let's say I click on this one, and in this what I say is there is a call to this particular API, and the API is Conversation API, which is followed by some sort of unique ID. And let's say if I were to say hi again, then the call to this Conversation API will have a conversation ID which is essentially the same conversation ID. So basically what you say is 42A6D, and 42A6D was the actual conversation ID as well. Let's say if I start a new conversation, so in that case there is no conversation as such because we have not initiated anything. But let's say I have the first conversation. Okay, we'll talk about potato, and then we have the conversation. To begin with, it won't have any conversation ID because this is the first chat in this particular thread. Now let's talk about another thing, maybe carrot as well. So this is the second message which is being sent in this particular thread, and let's see what happens. So as soon as we send this message, we have this conversation API which is getting fired, and we have the conversation ID which is getting attached to it. So now let's make a note of the conversation ID. So it's like EADE, the last four characters. And let's have another thing, another chat in this particular thread, and let's say thanks. So the conversation API will be making use of the same conversation ID, that is EADE. So here is the conclusion. Even in the case of ChatGPT Web UI, it does not have any implicit memory as such. Rather, it is passing a conversation ID, and based on that conversation ID, it is fetching the previous discussion somehow, and that is being used to propagate the discussion so far, and the discussion so far is going to help with the context management. We will do something similar in our case as well, where we will have some sort of context ID defined in our code, and that will be used to prepare the context. So before we go ahead with the details of the implementation, let's first check out what exactly we are planning to build. So here is the initial API that we built, which is the chat API, and all it was doing is it was accepting a message and making use of the chat client and calling the call method. But now in the message, it won't just contain the message as such. Rather, we will also send what all things we discussed in the past. So basically what all questions I asked the chat GPT, or rather I asked the chat completion API in the past, and based on that it will be able to retain or create some context internally. In order to do so, we will be thinking of some sort of prompt structure or the questioning structure. So here is how the prompt structure will look like. The first part is where we say that we have been talking about these things as of now, and then we will have a delimited padded list of previous questions which we asked. So let's say for example, questions that we asked is Q1, Q2 and Q3. Then these questions will be delimited somehow so that it's easier for chat completion API to understand what all things were discussed in the past. And the third part is where we tell what it has to do with it. So please note that the previous queries are delimited by so and so string, and make use of the contextual information about things discussed so far only if it's super necessary to answer the current question. Otherwise, ignore the historical discussion till now and answer or acknowledge from your general wisdom. So this is where we say that you either make use of the previous discussion or don't make use of it, depending on what is being asked. And there is one critical part. So what I have observed is whenever I have used any delimiter like this, then in that case, for some reason, chat completion API also starts giving the delimiter in the response as well, which we don't want certainly, right? So in order to do so, we include this string, which is like also don't include the delimiter in your response. So the final part of the prompt is this one, where we say, now here is your question, and this will be followed by the question which we ask to the chat completion API. So let's go ahead and build this functionality. So in order to build this functionality, first we will have to create some sort of a different controller, and in order to support that controller, we will also create certain service classes. So let's start with the service class first. So let's have this package in place, call it as service, and in this one let's create the conversational context service. So let's have it as a interface and call it as conversational context service, and it will contain two methods. So first one will help us with fetching all the context IDs that we have created till now. So why do we need this? So let's go back to the ChatGPT UI once again. So in this case, when you click on a particular chat, or let's say when you start a new chat, then UI is handling the part where it's going to fetch the conversation ID, and based on that it's going to maintain and create the context for the chat completion API. But in our case, we don't have a UI, so we will have to have some sort of mechanism where we knew the context ID, and that context ID along with the message could be passed to the new controller that we will be writing. So it will be very clear by the end of this tutorial, so keep on watching. So for now, let's create this particular method. So it's a list of a string, and it's called as fetch all context IDs, and let's import this one. Next would be string prepare prompt with context history, and this will accept two things. First is your context ID, second is your message itself. Now let's go ahead and create an implementation for this particular interface. The name could be conversational context service implementation. We will annotate this class with service annotation. And let's talk about how exactly are we going to store the context. So in real world scenario, probably this context could be stored in some sort of database, but here we are just going to show the demo that how exactly we can build the context with chat completion API. So in order to do that in a much simpler way, we will just have a hash map to store the context. So it could be a map of string followed by list of string, and then maybe call it as context store new hash map, and first thing to implement is the context ID. So we can return a new array list context store dot key set. So all the keys in this context store are the context IDs, and for a given context ID we could have different strings, that is a list of a string, which will be essentially what we have discussed till now. So that will be the list part, the value part. So we just fetch the key, that is the key set, and that key set will be made as a list of a string, and we return the same for the fetch all context ID. So this should conclude for this particular method. Now let's implement this method. So here what we do is we first start by checking if our context store contains the given context ID or not. So if context store dot contains key context ID, if it does not contain the context ID, then what do we do is we will have to create a list of a string, which is the history part of the previous conversation, and add the current message in that particular list and put that list in the context store along with the context ID, and finally return the message itself for the prompt. Because we are just creating this thing for the very first time, we don't want to associate this with any kind of historical information, because this is the first message in the entire conversation, very similar to what we do in the case of new chat and when we give certain question to the chat GPT. So this is the implementation we are going to have. So let's say we have new array list, and this could be your history. Now let's add the message to the history, and context store dot put context ID and the history, and just return the message. And this one should be not an object, rather it should be a string, and maybe we should be good with list, not the array list. So that's about the use case where we are going to send the first message for a given context ID. So we create the context ID, rather we create the entry for that particular context ID, and then in that entry we add the message, we put the entry in the map, and then we return the message itself. Now let's go to the else part where it could be already present in the context store. So what do we do? First thing to do is you fetch from the context store for that context ID. It will give you the list of strings, let's call it as history, and in the history add the current message. So now the current message has been added, and then populate the context store with the context ID and the updated history list. So by the end of this particular code block, what we have achieved is that we have created the history part of the previous conversation. And once we have the previous conversation, we start with the prompt building. So let's say string builder, maybe call it as prompt, and new string builder, and we fetch the history from the context store. So context store dot get context ID, and we have the history here. But now before moving to the further part of the implementation, what we will have to do is probably we will have to create some sort of string constant class where we have the different components of this prompt creation, right? And then we will make use of the same over here. So in order to save some time, I'll just type it quickly and probably edit it out, and then we will continue the implementation here to be continued. So first let's create the package constants, and then create the class, maybe call it as prompt constants. So alright, we have created the prompt constants class, and here is the entry in this particular class. So the first part of this is the prompt delimiter, and I have just put a random prompt delimiter string in here. Idea is to have something so random that it may not be present in any of the input strings that we have asked in the past. And the next thing is what we were talking about till now. So we have been talking about so and so. So basically this part of the prompt, and the next one is this part of the prompt where we say that please take a note that previous queries are delimited by the given delimiter. And the next part is where we say that use the context only if it is needed, otherwise don't use it anyway. And the final thing is where we say that this is your current question. So now with this in place, let's go ahead and continue our implementation here. So for now our prompt is blank, and what we will do is in the blank prompt we will append the first constant, which is what we were talking about till now. And with this in place, now we are going to build the second part of the prompt, which is the string which is delimiter padded. And in order to do so, we will be iterating over the history list, history.size and prompt.append. So we will implement some sort of helper method. Idea of the helper method would be to take a string and then pad it with the delimiter string. So for now, just write the method name. We can implement it later on. So maybe it could be pad string with delimiter, and then the string which we want to pad is the current string in the history list. And let's implement it. So private string, and we could just return prompt constant dot delimiter plus the s string, and then prompt constant dot delimiter. So that's about it. And what we have done is we have just accessed the history list till the second last entry in the list. Reason is the last element is essentially the current question, and till the second last it's all the previous questions which has been asked. We are going to place the delimiter for the previous questions, not for the current question itself. So once this is done, then we will have to add some other prompts. So prompt dot append prompt constants dot prompt delimiter for historical context. Now next could be prompt constants dot prompt use context if needed, and then this one could be the current question, and the current question is prompt dot append history dot get history dot size -1, right? Now let's return the toString of the prompt builder, and this should help us with the final prompt that we need to give to the chat completion API. So let's have a quick revision around what we have done. So till this part of the code, we have created the historical details of the questions we have asked till now and have kept that in the list of a string. And here onwards we started creating the prompt itself. So basically we had kept a string builder as the prompt. Then we fetch for the given context ID all that has been asked in past. So that is a list of a string. And then first we start with the appending of the first part of the prompt, which is what we were talking about till now. Then we iterated the history list, and till the second last element in the history list, that is what we have asked till now, we appended that with the delimiter, and then we appended the same in the prompt. So this is the second part of the prompt. Then the third part is where we say that this is the delimiter for the historical context, and the fourth is like use this context only if it is needed, otherwise don't use it. And then finally we say that here is your current question, and we provide the current question in the prompt, and finally we return the prompt itself. So with this in place, we can go ahead and start writing the controller as well. So let's go to the controller package and let's create a new class, and we can call this as context aware basic chat controller. Maybe call it as REST controller. We should have a request mapping as well. So we do AI, and we will need to have two dependencies. So first one would be the OpenAI chat client. The second one would be conversational service. So maybe call it as context service, and then have a constructor to auto wire these dependencies, call it as auto wired, and then we can implement the different endpoints that we wish to implement. So the first one which we are going to have is the API which will give us all the context IDs which has been created till now. So the mapping could be /context, and then we can start by writing the method itself. So list of string and fetch all context IDs and context service dot fetch all IDs dot return. And this one, let's import it to resolve the error. And the second API which we can implement is the actual chat API. So let's have this as /chat, and this one is going to return me a string of a string, and let's call it as chat. So it will be expecting us to pass two parameters. The first one would be the context ID and the second one would be the message. So let's create it accordingly. The value is context ID, the default value is a blank string, and then the name of this field is context ID. Let's maximize this window. The next on the list would be the request param for the message. So value is message, default value is tell me a random fact, then the field name would be message itself. And now with this in place, we start the implementation. So first thing to check while doing the implementation is if the context ID is empty. So is it empty? If so, then let's create a context ID right away, and we can use random UUID to string. Otherwise, if it's not empty, then we can simply use the context ID which is flowing from the API itself, and we can call context service dot prepare prompt with context history, pass in the context ID, pass in the message, and then capture this as the prompt string. Now we can return map.off, and the key could be generated like we had in the first example, and this one could be chat client dot call, and we pass the prompt here. So this should conclude the implementation part of the second API as well, and we have the controller for the context aware basic chat controller. Now let's do one thing, let's give it a run and see how it's coming up. So we have done this. Now let's go to the Postman and see what is happening. So this is the first API which we saw earlier. So essentially this one, the basic chat controller, where we did not have any context of what we were discussing earlier. Now in the second API, which is this one, let's go ahead and give some message. So please note that we are not providing any context ID, which is like we are starting a new message conversation with the chat completion API. And let's ask it the same question. So what is Google? Tell me in one line. So it says Google is a multinational technology company and so on and so forth, right? Now let's quickly check the context API and see what are contexts we have now. So we have this context created. So with this context ID in place, what we can do is, if I wish to continue in the same thread where we are discussing about Google, and in future probably we can discuss more details about certain other things, then I'll have to bind this context ID with this conversation. Otherwise, this is as good as having a separate conversation altogether. And when you are going to ask it some questions related to do you know the context or not, probably it will start saying that it does not know the context. So in order to do so, let's enable this context ID request parameter and pass the request ID which has been generated for this discussion here, right? And then have this request ID tied to this one. and then probably ask it the second question. So who are its top competitors? So now with the context in place that we are talking about Google, AI should be able to figure out the context of the question and tell us who are its competitors. So yeah, it's figuring out the context and it's answering that include top companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and IBM as well for some reason. All right, now we can say is Apple a fruit as well? And it says yes. So can I call my friend with this apple? All right, so basically the previous question was that is apple a fruit as well. It's really doing a good job at maintaining the context, and it's saying that no, you cannot call your friend with an apple because an apple is a fruit, not a communication device. So let's see what does it say in this case. So with what kind of apple can I call my friend? So you can call your friend with an Apple iPhone, not the fruit. So it's really doing a great job at maintaining the context now. So basically whatever we have discussed till now, it's keeping everything in its brain, and using that it's answering us the questions that we are asking. Now let's ask the final question. Summarize all we have discussed till now briefly. So here is the summary. We have talked about Google being search engine, top competitors, confirming Apple is a fruit, and questioning, and we discussed possibility different kind of apple to call a friend. So I think it's doing a fairly great job at whatever we were expecting it to do, and we have created a sort of makeshift arrangement in which we are able to retain the context of whatever we are going to discuss with the endpoint, right? Now let's try it with some other question. So maybe call it as what birds don't fly. And now we should have a new context added to this one. So now this is the new context, the one with the 777. So we have a new context, and if you wish to continue your discussion in the same context where we were discussing about birds, you could do the same thing, as in you could append the context ID that we have here, this context ID, and then it should work as expected. So I think it's doing a good job at retaining the context. Now let's discuss a few more things about it. So here could be a very general concern. So as I told in the previous video, that tokens are kind of currency in the hosted AI models space. And let's say if your discussion is kind of growing further and further, then because we are including everything that we discussed in the past, it's going to increase the token size, the token consumption. Then what we can do to ensure that we are not getting into a situation where it's getting out of hand and we are not able to handle it, because in certain cases we will reach the point of context window and it will not even accept the prompt, right? So what I'm trying to say is, let's say if your context window is 10 tokens and the prompt that you have created is probably of 50 tokens, then 40 will be rejected straight away, and that is not good. So there are different ways in which we can do it. One of the ways is probably you could have a smart logic where you are creating the context, right? So basically when you are creating the prompt, here you could figure out that based on the kind of model you are using, what is the context size, and as long as your context size is not getting breached, probably you could go ahead with this implementation. But in cases where the context size is going to increase, you could have some sort of summarizing mechanism. So basically you could ask the AI to summarize whatever we have discussed till now, so that you will end up with a shorter prompt size, and then probably do something similar. Other approach could be where you could just consider a few of the previous discussion questions and not the entire thread as such, and that should also help us with maintaining the context. So I think these are a couple of approaches and of course you may wish to read more about it, and this is one way in which we could implement it. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, that here we are doing everything in memory. In a real world system, probably we won't be storing these things in a memory, rather we'll have some sort of a storage layer which will be storing these things in the database. So that shall be it for this video. I hope this added some value. Thanks for sticking with me till last. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel. I hope this video added some value. If so, please hit that like button and share with your friends. Your honest feedback in the comments is valuable to me. I regularly post informative videos on software engineering and computer science. Don't forget to hit the bell for instant updates. Take care and stay awesome.